welcome to our Search Mastery Speaker Series initial event for fall 2022. My name is Marianne Francis, and I'll be moderating the session today. We do have a couple opportunities as we go through the talk for Q&A and chat. If you want to chat with the group, you can just click on the chat button, and if you want to address the moderators, you can, and the speaker, you can do that, or if you want to default to the entire group, you can do that as well. Then you can enter questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. If there's something that's timely, I'll go ahead and address it, and if we have something that's better left to the end, we'll have a Q&A session at the end as well. So that's kind of it for the logistics. Now I want to introduce our speaker, Colin Hayhurst, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Mojeek. And Colin is, as I said, he's the Chief Executive Officer of Mojeek Limited, a fully remote company with its roots in the UK. He heads up a dynamic team who are working hard to ensure that there is a true choice in search independent of big tech. Colin has a vast array of entrepreneurial experience within the tech world, with proven commercial and technical experience in startups, academia, and industry. He's been a co-founding CEO or CTO of 3 startups in high-performance computing, web infrastructure, and machine learning, respectively. His international business experience is predominantly in the UK, Europe, and the US, including the Y Combinator 2012 summer cohort. So after that introduction, I am just going to turn the presentation over to Colin, and we're really excited and happy to have you with us today.
Okay, thanks for that kind of introduction, and nice to present it to you all, and looking forward to talking about Mojeek and hearing your questions. Can I just check that everybody can see the slides and can hear me okay?
I can see and hear.
Great. Okay. So, as Marianne said, this is a talk about Mojeek, which we think of as an alternative in web search, which for reasons that I'll try to explain. So, I think there's obviously a recording of this presentation, and I'm going to provide the presentation, which has got a number of hyperlinks to information if you want to dig deeper into things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to try and finish in time, so we've got time for questions. So excuse me if I talk too, well, I always talk too fast anyway, everybody says that, and I apologise for my British accent, my fast speaking, and my English spellings. Actually, I don't apologise for my English spellings. There we go. So anyway, here's an introduction to the talk. I'm going to talk about some search definitions, so that I think there's a lot of terms that are used, particularly on the marketing side of search, which are somewhat confusing, shall we say. I'll talk a bit about the Mojeek history, which is a long one, and I'll talk about the infrastructure, although I'll be saving the details of that until later into the presentation. I want to talk about what I think we need as a society, as individuals, users in search in general, and how that guides what we do and drives what we do at Mojeek, motivates us. I'm going to talk about the sort of guiding principles we have behind us developing and providing Mojeek, which is kind of core to our proposition, I guess, for most of our users. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the challenges of building a search engine from the ground up, which is what we've done at Mojeek. So as Marianne said, I do have, I've got a sort of technical background. I was a kind of a developer for 20 years, particularly in computational physics, did a lot of algorithm programming and so on, but it's a long time since I was coding, so you know, I can't answer sort of deep technical questions, but I think we can dig into some this kind of level that's probably going to be interesting to you, I hope. So I'm going to run through this fairly fast because I'm assuming that the audience, although I know it's mixed in terms of experience, is probably going to be familiar with a lot of these terms. You know, so, but just for clarity, so when I'm talking about a search engine, I'm going to be talking in this context about kind of traditional search engine with a crawler, an index, and ranking algorithms. I'm going to refer to a search proxy, which is a term that some people use as referring to being used by a service which uses the index of another search engine. Which you know, most so-called search engines on the market are actually search proxies, not search engines. And then a term that you don't hear so often nowadays, I guess it was much more prevalent sort of 15 years ago, is meta search, where there's a service which uses proxies 2 or more search engines. That's not so easy to do nowadays because it's kind of being companies are discouraged from happening. So. Which is kind of a shame. And so if we talk about the traditional search engine stack, then just digging in a bit more detail. So a crawler is a bot which browses the web to discover content used to build an index. And the search index is obviously is a key part, is the compact structures, data structures, databases that are made from that crawled data. And then there's ranking, where we have algorithms which determine how search results are ranked, how they might be displayed and provided to the user, of course. Well, in fact, actually, the provision to the user is obviously through a service. So I like to use the term search service because that's, you know, as in software as a service. So we're all familiar with webs and apps which provide services. In this case, we're providing search results which come typically from the ranking of a search engine. And so in other words, from an organization which has a search engine itself or not. So a search service could be Mojeek, and a search service could be DuckDuckGo, which is actually a search proxy using Bing, for instance, as I'm sure most people here are aware, but many people aren't. But search services vary a lot. They might, as we mentioned, they might be using one search engine, or sometimes, but not so often nowadays, more. A number of them use APIs from other web services to provide like instant answers and information boxes and so on, and utilities. And you know, those web services wouldn't be necessarily search engines. So you know, for instance, DuckDuckGo uses the API of Stack Overflow, and many others. There's also some of the providers are using various machine learning techniques in all sorts of interesting ways. And one typical one is to actually use machine learning to to do their ranking based on correlating with some ground truth. And you know, typically that ground truth would be kind of Google search results. So if Google rank the results this way, then we're going to try and correlate a machine learning model to actually produce a similar ranking. And then I guess I'm going to put this in the bad actors category, which I'll talk about in detail later. There's also rather a lot of search services out there which most people have never heard of, but because they're used by a few users, but they're actually appearing to provide a search service, or even they claim it's a search engine by just scraping results from Google or from Bing or from us or even from other search services. So this is a real problem for, well, I guess it's probably a problem for us because in terms of us actually people appreciating the differentiation of Mojeek with what is historically been called privacy search engines. So we tend to be put in the box of privacy search engines. As I explained later, we were actually the first of those, but actually we're not unique, but almost unique in being the only private search engine, and most of the so-called private search engines are actually search services or search proxies. So how do you tell if it's a search engine or not? Well, there are some technical methods you can use to find out. we're tempted to publish those, but we use them ourselves, but we haven't chosen not to, because we suspect that if we did publish them, then the people who are trying to pretend would put in some methods to prevent us find out what we find and others can find. So there's a couple of useful utilities, which actually I think this is how the college found out about Mojeek. Is we actually run a little project called Search Engine Map, which we kind of did as a little education and stroke marketing tool to try and clarify some of the things that I've just talked about. So you can go to that link there. I apologise. It is the project's currently about a year out of date. We're probably going to do an update to it within the next month. In fact, we're going to open source that project as well at the same time. So that's something that's holding it up. So, but that'll give you kind of gives a nice network diagram of the search engines and the search proxies. And then the most informed blog article on search engines and search proxies by an independent outsider is the link I've shown there. So if you're going to dip into this whole area, that's definitely a big recommend for a read. So let's now talk about Mojeek. Mojeek's history. So we have a long history. Mojeek actually started in 2004 when our founder Mark Smith decided he wanted well, in fact, he decided he wanted to learn C. So he thought, what should I do? What should I do as a little project to learn C, or I'll have a go at writing a little simple search engine. And that kind of little hobby project turned quickly into a bit of an obsession. And within the, he's been a experienced developer, was doing apps and websites for people, but within the first year, it was a kind of part-time project. He'd actually made Mojeek available to users, and people started using it from the get-go. So he was actually running Mojeek from 2 servers in his bedroom down here in the southeast of England, just actually on the south coast. It's just due south of London. And so, he pretty much worked on his own, and actually sort of basically wrote everything from scratch. So obviously, he read any publications. He read the PageRank paper. He used I guess he used the only bit of open source we really use is curl. Everything else has been written from the ground up, and up until recent years by Mark. And so, actually from the very start, he made a decision not to track people at all. So he basically just collected just some very basic logs, which is still the case today. And that was kind of that was motivated by 2 things. I think it's partly his personality. So he's a very ethically driven guy. And part of the reason, in fact, he wanted to start search engine because he was very concerned about the way he perceived Google to developing back in 2004. So it was actually in 2006. He actually on the website he actually made a public declaration, which you can find on the archive, where he stated that Mojeek wasn't tracking you. So that traces back to that date, and even though actually he wasn't tracking right from the start. So actually, Mojeek's been around a long time, and it's actually kind of predates IXQuake, although that did come out very soon afterwards, and obviously quite a few years before Go started. And so we've kept that proposition since. So he actually kept working on that, and then in 2009, he needed to basically move it out of his bedroom. And he realised he's going to have to be out of his bedroom at some stage, and somebody said, look, I think this is getting quite serious. If you're going to make it successful, you need to turn it into a business. So he incorporated in 2009. In 2011, he moved into the data centre. Actually, the data centre company that we're still with, although he started off in a smaller room, and actually started building his own servers, which I'll talk about later on. You can see here on the right some of our switches and some of the servers, and one of the racks of servers that we've more recently put in. So it reached about 1 billion pages in 2015, 2 billion in 2018, and 3 billion in 2020. One of the big things that we'll talk about later on, but the big challenge he's had is actually developing the index to be fast enough. So he's actually rewritten the architecture, the sort of coding for the indexing 3 times. But all it's been, I can't remember when he last wrote it, it's now very stable and very scalable. He hasn't changed it for a long time, but it basically didn't work the first 2 times when, once it got to a certain size. So in 2020, actually, so I joined Mojeek. I was brought in as he raised a bigger round of investment from one angel investor, and the angel investor asked him to take it to market to find a CEO. So I came in, and he put in some more money, and then we've kind of gone to market. So Mojeek's been around a long time, not very well known at all. Basically because it's been Mark and there's a few people who helped me out over the years, but there hasn't really been a team or any serious marketing done. But we've obviously worked on that in the last 2 years. So we've also ramped up the infrastructure. We've brought out some, and we just hit 6 billion in terms of web pages indexed, and we brought in some innovations, which I'll talk about later, which are choices and focus. And there's some more details about the actual history of Mojeek at that link at the bottom there. So I'm now going to give some opinions on what I think we need in search. I'm going to dive into these in more detail. So under the title shown there, obviously, I've got the graphic there, which some of you might recognise from back in the early 1900s of the picture of Standard Oil, and obviously the current monopoly we have in search is not of the same nature and is a lot more sophisticated than Standard Oil were. But some of the problems we do have are the same. So monopolies, whether you have with Google or not, monopoly is not, in my opinion, very healthy, and what we need is informational diversity, and that will be helped by not having a monopoly on search. So the other aspects are autonomy, not control, and privacy and surveillance, which we might as well just dive into. So on diversity, obviously social media monopolies have consequences that we're probably all well aware of now, and obviously the media's been talking about this for a number of years, more and more. And people get very angry on social media about social media and the consequences, and we're all aware of them. But what's not talked about a lot is the monopoly we have in search, and what are the consequences of that. And I think the consequences are very significant and not and deep, and perhaps not so obvious, and certainly not obvious to the general public. I don't think it's a healthy situation. Apologies if you're listening and you work at Google, but I don't think it's healthy. It's not about Google, it's about a situation where we've got sort of Google or any company, and Baidu and Yandex dominating search in the USA, China and Russia. And so this is one of the things again that motivated Mark, and motivates us as a team to try and provide some diversity in their search results. So we've taken the hard road of building Mojeek as a totally independent search engine and built it from the ground up. So if you use Mojeek, you're going to get completely different results, very different results from Google and from Bing and from the search proxies that they use. And so obviously we try to deliver some search diversity. We would be happy if there were more independent search engines around, but it's a hard thing to do. There's been some attempts in the past to do this, but it's a hard challenge. It takes you need to build your own infrastructure. It needs real capital. But we do advocate for search diversity. We really believe in it, and we try and deliver on it. And we also try to practice what we preach. So we introduced something which we call search choices at the start of this year, which is one of the things that I sort of suggested that we include as innovation in Mojeek. It's not an amazing innovation. It's very simple to do, to be honest. It's just a referral link out to other search engines and proxies. It works a bit, you can think of it a bit like bangs, but it's different to bangs. And it's something that we're looking to extend, and we have this actually has kind of grown. So we now have Brave and Yep also do search choices with buttons in their results, just as we do. But we also have a different thing where you can actually select them from the search bar, the search box as well. So it's slightly different, a bit more user friendly and flexible. Again, with all these things, there's some links at the bottom of pages if you want to look into more information about these things. A lot of these links are links to our blog. So what about autonomy? So we try to provide more autonomy for our users. One of the big things is that we always provide 1,000 results. If you've got 1,000 results, and we nearly always have more than 1,000 results, and typically we've got millions of results. We don't obviously have as many as Google or Bing typically, but when you do use Mojeek, you'll see the number of search results at the top. There is a precise number. So it might be 5,300,467. That means we did find that many. When you did the search query, we went to all our shards, as you hear earlier, all those web pages we've indexed, and we did find that many matches. And then we then provide up to 1,000 results. We can't provide them all for practical reasons, which I'll explain later, but we always provide 1,000 results. Nowadays on Google, the numbers are variable. I think the average about 250, 300, but they vary quite a lot. Bing's even varies a lot more, and it's not even clear. With Google, it's pretty clear they're all unique results. With Bing, there seems to be some repetition, but I'm not sure what's happening there, but somebody else can explain that. So that's one aspect, and you can do all sorts of other things which I'm not mentioning here, like you can have 10 results or 40 results or whatever. You can specify what country you want the search results to be biased to, or to be unbiased for none. You can vary the snippet length very, very dramatically from 0 up to a lot more than Google and Bing, up to 511 characters. So you can extract a lot of information for snippets. You can turn off the info box if you don't want to have that in there to sort of get a bias. You just want pure organic results, which you see a lot of in Mojeek. And that includes, typically that will include information from Wikipedia. And then, the big thing which we just kind of soft launched or released in a couple of months ago now is what we call Mojeek Focus. So this is I'm showing this on the screenshot here. It's probably a bit too small to see, but you can see here there's a dashboard here where you can set up. In fact, I think this has got set up. Let's see, it's got. There are 4 template focus engines which we've provided, and then there's 4 that I've set up myself to cover money, social and wikis, video, and recipes, or edited version recipes of our standard one. So in this is a bit like, very like Google programmable search, but I think we think of it a lot more user friendly and accessible, and it allows you to do the search across. Obviously, a subset of the index of the web that we index, and you can include domains, or you can also exclude domains. So that's a kind of a very useful tool, which is works for a lot of circumstances, and people seem to like. So moving on to surveillance. So we, as I mentioned, Mojeek was was a privacy search engine before anybody else, but we'd like to think of it. We take things a lot further than almost any others. So we're not into privacy washing. So you can see the list of things there. We don't use analytics. We don't use capture services, which some people do use and don't realise they're actually helping other companies with data. We don't pass on any data. So we don't if you send search queries to Mojeek, they're not going on to Microsoft, right? They're coming straight through to us. If you're using a proxy of Bing, then you're probably sending if not your whole IP address part, probably the first 3 octets of your IP address, although I've never seen that published, but people have told me that's the case. But obviously we're not doing that either. So you are, you have to trust us, but you're inside with us. In fact, what we do is we totally discard the IP address as soon as we've seen it. We do look at that because we have to deal with bad actors, as you'll see later on. And all we do is we just convert that IP address into a country code, which we put in our logs. So we don't sell or distribute any data. We put our browser data in separate logs. We've got anonymous usage, and we only use a local cookie, so we call it a zero-party cookie. It's not even first or third party cookie. And in fact, we've just introduced, I think a couple of weeks ago, what's a truly cookieless option. So you can use Mojeek and you can specify your preferences or settings without having to use cookies at all. And that's done through through parameters in the URL. So as we say, your personal data is sacrosanct and it's not a strategic asset. And this is not a comment on just search engines. It's also a comment on governments. And I just thought I'd put for your amusement here a rant I did on Twitter about my own government's national data strategy, which states, as I've highlighted there, personal data is a huge strategic asset. Well, yes, you can see what I think of it there. And there's a whole blog post about that which you can look at if you want to. So I'm talking very rapidly, and I apologise, but I want to try and cover a lot of ground here and give you time for questions. So I'm going to run through these next sort of 4 slides very quickly, so we do have that time and we can talk about the search architecture. So what are the principles we are guided by at Mojeek? So they are these 4 here. So I'm going to just dive straight in and talk about these. And I've gone past one already. So the first one's information neutrality. So with Mojeek, our philosophy is that 2 users using Mojeek with the same search query at the same time, with the same location, language settings, they should, and they will get exactly the same results. So we are totally against personalization. We do understand that can be useful and it's convenient and can make things more user friendly, but we actually think it's also got some toxic side effects, and so we stand against that and we always have done. I've discussed that at length in a submission we've made to the UK government, which you can access if you're interested in this topic at the bottom there. And I won't read it out, and you can read this later. But this, we're kind of using I don't know whether this author from 2016 was referring to search or not. I can't remember, but essentially it's there's a definition there of information neutrality. So that's what we aspire to provide in Mojeek. We also, feel strongly about the freedom to seek and human rights. I'm going to talk about human rights next. And so, what our concern is that, unlike freedom of speech issues where, if you're on social media, a post gets taken down, it's kind of obvious and people can rant and rave. In search, what doesn't show, this is my quote, by the way, my 2 quotes, what doesn't show you may never know. And, and if Twitter has a freedom of speech problem, then Google has a freedom to seek problem. But obviously different natures. So, I think it's an important one. So I've written about that at length, and we sort of pin our contents. But we have a full contents policy where we explain how we do deal with things like child sexual abuse material, terrorism, malware, and so on. We also write in that about how we're guided by human rights. And again, I'm not going to read this out again, but it's as we sort of got thing to remember about human rights is to remember there's articles 19, 29, and 30 from which are included there, where in 19 you actually have the freedom to seek expressed as well as a part of the freedom of expression, but that's subject to limits of law and just requirements of morality and so on. And so what's frustrating about, I'm sure for all of us, about the debates about freedom to speech is that people talk about the rights expressed in Articles 19 and are either not aware of or ignore, or the things that are expressed in 29 and 30. So let's moving on. This is very timely. Actually, yesterday we announced together with 11 other organisations and projects, including Brave, Proton, Tor, and so on, and actually David Carroll, who's from the Great Hack. We actually announced the Privacy Pledge, which is a set of principles about privacy. I've given you here the summary text for the principles. You can go and read the sort of fuller paragraphs for each of those principles in the link there and our own perspective. And so, so the one I'm going to mention here is actually number 2 here, which is really about, organisations should only collect data that's necessary to prevent abuse and deliver their services. So that's, that exactly aligns with the way we act. And in fact, so we've actually for a long time been using the principle of data minimisation, which we kind of abbreviate as with this our simple term, no tracking, just search. But there's various definitions of data minimisation, but probably the one that's probably notable for I guess what's almost will be a US audience is a statement from Rebecca Slaughter of the FTC, who's been advocating for this for a number of years and increasingly is talking about the importance of it. So moving on, let's to what might be the interesting bit for some of you is the technical challenges. So I'm going to talk about our data center, our servers, the search stack, and how we deal with search queries. So firstly, the data center. Now, as I mentioned sort of briefly before, Mojeek is completely independent apart from when it comes to the data center. So everything else is we own, we have built, developed from the ground up. We don't have the resources to have our own data center, but it was important for us to use an independent data center, so independent of the big companies. And so we're using a company called Custodian. We're actually, importantly for us, we chose because they have a very low environmental impact, so they take the green credentials very seriously, and they've actually won awards for being a UK's greenest data centre. We have our own dedicated secure rooms in that facility, so it's which only we have access to. You can see a picture there of one of the corridors with our the server racks there inside the enclosures. And so so that's really important to us. So a little bit about the servers with some little montage there, photo of some of the components. So we actually buy the components in and then assemble them ourselves. So everybody in the team has a go at this. So I've been building servers. We upgraded, put in another 100 servers in about a couple of months ago, which we're all involved in. Those of us are local to the data center. And so anyway, as you can read there, we're using Supermicro twin node servers. We're using dual Intel Xeon CPUs, Micron RAM, 128 gigabytes, and we're using solid state drives. So we've got solid state drives. We're gradually replacing them for speed on all the servers. So we've got that on a lot of the servers now, and we've got hard disk drives which do the things which aren't speed critical, like installing the operating system for each of the shards on there. If you want to look in more depth, there's a link there to a nice little video which we have as doing some assembly of parts and racking up the servers into the data center room that we have. So moving on, crawling. Crawling's much less of a challenge than indexing. People on this talk are probably aware of that, but generally we find that when we talk to most people, even very technical people about search, they don't realise that, and they think, oh, I can build a search engine, I just need to crawl the web. Well, no, it's not that simple. And particularly if you're going to index billions of pages, it's extremely difficult, and we'll talk about that later on. But there are big difficulties involved in crawling. There are literally hundreds of them, which I don't know all the details Mark's had to deal with and his colleagues. But the two big ones which are worth mentioning, which I also get involved in resolving. the robots.txt files and WAF, so web application frameworks. So on robots.txt, I'm going to assume that people here are aware of what they are, and that's a file which websites can declare to say how they want to be crawled. So we have our search bot, or our spider, Mojeek bot, which is called Mojeek bot, has been crawling respectfully since 2004. So we've got a good reputation. We do crawl respectfully. So this is not true for a number of bots, but we do suffer from this because there are sites we could index, but we don't. That's our approach to everything. So now the problem is that some sites only allow large search engines, and often it's just Google. Now sometimes that's a business decision, particularly with the bigger sites. So for instance, LinkedIn, not surprisingly, don't let us crawl that. It is after all a Microsoft company. So I guess that's not too surprising. Facebook don't let us, although that doesn't upset us too much because we probably have a lot more noise and less signal. And there's a pretty long list of other ones, but we kind of knock those off one by one as we come across them. We think they're of concern, but that's always going to be an ongoing challenge. On the smaller sites, there's you've got all sorts of combinations of things like ignorance, webmasters, laziness, or just pure incompetence. It could be one or more of those. Which is kind of inevitable, I suppose. So for the WAFs, so this is different. This is where, for those of you not aware, these are where you've got proprietary software that websites use to keep out bad actors. So WAFs typically have things where they have different rules for different types of bots. And obviously, search engine bots is one of the things that they would, have rules on. And so one of the problems we face is actually, Mojeek's not well known, although we act respectfully. It's not well known, and so people just haven't heard of that, so we get ruled out. But we've had we generally have a lot of success, and we've managed to unlock some of the big ones, so like Cloudflare and Imperva and so on. But we do occasionally discover a new one, which is we've come across where we've been had a problem. But generally, we contact people, which takes a bit of a time, and that gets resolved eventually. So, and obviously that's in relation to the kind of supplier defaults that they have, their default rules. This varies greatly by the different tools that are out there, but they would then allow different levels of customer tuning. So, a customer of, say, Cloudflare could choose to be more aggressive in terms of what bots they allow onto their site, and so rather than accepting the default settings, they might want to ramp up their defenses, and that's where we can often, we sometimes suffer, not particularly on Cloudflare, but on other ones.
Hey, Colin, can I ask a question at this point?
Of course.
So I'm wondering, maybe you'll get to this when you cover the indexing. What you're talking to us about here, can you describe how that affects the search results, and then how Mojeek search results would be different from others, or
right? Yeah.
Is that not a relevant question?
Yeah. So. Right, so if we can't index the sites, then what we can't do is actually show the snippets. So we may crawl and discover the destination through backlinks from other ones there. So we might show search results. So you will see results, for instance, on Mojeek from Facebook. That's not because we're indexing Mojeek, it's because we're actually seeing the links to Facebook. So that's not quite answering your question, but it's related to it. I mean, maybe it's one to come back to at the end when we've talked about indexing.
Okay.
But yeah, generally, it's. I mean, it is a big issue. If you, there are. If people are, if somebody wants to use Mojeek to search LinkedIn, it's not going to work. I mean, they probably go to LinkedIn if they want to do that, but if they wanted to search across to say, you know, LinkedIn and Facebook and some others, then they're just going to get some results from some of the others. So yes, it is an issue, and you know, it's one of the, you know, it's one of the areas where Google has a massive advantage, because people just, you know, just think there's only Google. I only care about Google. So, you know, I just want Google to index me. It doesn't. The other ones don't matter. So yes, it is a big issue. So I'm going to talk about indexing, because indexing is kind of the big technical challenge. I'm actually going to do this by actually walking you through how Mojeek kind of works, kind of conceptually. Well, yes, it's quite a bit of detail, but obviously not. There's a lot more detail to it than this. But and I'll try and I may lose people here. I may even lose myself, but I think it's probably worth a go. So Mojeek is built with basically shards. And so on each shard we have web pages which are indexed, and what we do is the process is that when a search query goes in, every shard in Mojeek actually ranks the top 1,000 candidate results web pages or indexes of web pages that would match the query. So yes, so each shard then has 1,000 results. We then have search slave servers, and they which take the results from the shards. So we have n of these, and which actually access each of them s shards. That's why. So we have n times s shards. And what those slave servers do is they then rank again from the top SK. So if it was, you know, 50 shards, then it would be 50,000 pages, and comes up again with the top 1,000. So we've gone down. So we've now got a top 1,000 across those shards, across those set of shards. Sorry. We then have a search master server, which receives the top 1,000 results from each of those search slaves. And then it ranks those. And so if there was 10 slaves, then we'd be ranking the 10,000 results and coming up with the final top 1,000. And that's why we have then 1,000 results that are available, we can provide to the user in response to a search request. Okay, so obviously we can't provide results to beyond 1,000 without having to, you know, architect it differently and or go back round again and so on. You know, generally, if you can't find the relevant results with the first 1,000, then it's not really going to be very useful. So, okay, then to actually respond to the search requests, which might of course be coming simultaneously, you know, multiple search queries, or you know, be coming in at a rapid rate. We then have search proxy servers, which prepare the client display of search results requested in the following steps. So they request data for the results, the search results, which are by default to 10, although, you know, users can change that to a maximum of 40 by 40 in their kind of standard settings, and they get those results from what's our database, our text database server, what's called a text database server. And that text database server requests the data by going back to all the relevant shards. So, you know, it takes the 10 results and goes to the shards where the data for those 10 results are. So it might obviously typically it will be going to 10 different shards and extracting back and bringing back the data so that it can actually then it can compute the full the snippet from the full text for the pages for those results. Okay, now the snippets is actually a very computationally intensive task. It takes up a big amount of the time of the searching. So if we did search results, which we can do without snippets, actually Mojeek, it will be a lot faster. But typically people want snippets, right? So we then provide the search results, and then provided then is obviously by default a title, a URL, and a snippet. Okay, and then we've got as many proxy servers as needed for us to handle the volume of overlapping or, you know, or rapid rate in-time searches, and that's built in a scalable way, so we can expand out the number of search proxy servers to deal with whatever traffic we have. There's all sorts of other details in there, but the one thing I will mention is caching. So caching is used for speed and efficiency, obviously. So a good example would be, if somebody does a search result by default, they're going to get 10 results. And if they might then say, well, okay, I want to see results 11 to 20, so they hit the next page, the bottom of the SERPs page, and then we can then by using caching, we can then go back and get that information without having to go through the full cycle that I've described above. Okay, so that's a lot of detail there, and I've probably explained it very well, but hopefully that's given you a bit of insight into how Mojeek works and how it's how the architecture will be set up. So the next thing is ranking. I'm coming towards the end now, and I want to wrap up so we've got some time for questions. We can obviously talk about ranking for hours, but obviously we're using all sorts of factors and signals in our ranking, and techniques to match the search queries to the text. At Mojeek, by the way, currently we're not indexing images or videos, so we're talking about text here. What we have is obviously that matching is done when based on weightings, which we're looking at a match between the search query and the search results. But we also have a search query independent authority score, which we call gravity. It's similar to PageRank, but it's not the same as PageRank. Conceptually it's pretty similar, but it is quite different. That's obviously a key aspect of Mojeek, and we have to, that's when we update that algorithm. It's a big computation, so we have to, we don't do it too often. Just like Google don't update theirs too often. In Mojeek, we don't use a lot of machine learning. We definitely don't use as much machine learning as Microsoft and Google and Baidu do. So actually one of the advantages of this is that our kind of algorithms are more, if you like, deterministic. And actually, one of the advantages of this is that what we'd like to do in the future is to make it give the users more control over ranking. We could do this now. We've just got too many things to do. So we've put together some ideas about how we could give users more control over the ranking, which I think benefit users and also solve some other problems which I don't really have time to discuss here. So I can't finish without mentioning bad actors. I'm sure many of you, if not some of you, will be aware that building a search engine or providing a search service, bad actors is a real big problem. Bad actors is a problem for any popular website, I guess, but on search engines, it's really rather severe. So we are having to deal every day with new challenges dealing with bad actors, automated bots, and so our legitimate human queries amount to currently a lot less than 10% of the queries that actually we get hit by at Mojeek, and that's I've not seen much published on this, but I know from speaking to people and anecdotally that's the case for all search engines and services. That have some visibility and awareness. And so there's all sorts of things here. Scrapers is a big one. Obviously, general scrapers. Scrapers are actually we've got scrapers that actually target search services to scrape results to try and create a search engine themselves, or a fake search engine, as I call it. And sometimes they're finding content that they're using search engines to find content that they then want to scrape for other reasons. Obviously got botnets and viruses and hackers looking for vulnerable sites to target. So there's all sorts of threats out there, which makes it a big challenge. But what we don't do, by the way, is we've resisted using captures yet for reasons I mentioned before. Because if somebody's aware of a tracking independent good capture technology, I'd be interested to hear about it. So I think this is my sort of last slide, but two. I just want to mention I mentioned that one of the big challenges is response times. I got very lucky because I actually I wanted to show these two images, and I regenerated them today, about noon today. On the right is our internal response time metrics about noon today. And you probably can't read this, but this shows the aggregated response times. and it shows there the average response time is 194 milliseconds. The median is 83. Some of the high, as you'll see, there's a big scale. So when you get to the 90th percentile, 90th percentile is at 547 microseconds. Obviously, some of the retrievals, when you go to the shards and compute the snippets, that can take a long time. So we've got, there's a small number of the retrievals do actually take a long time. So, but obviously the median average times are very low. And actually, Mojeek is invariably, if you use this independent speed test tool from eTools, which you can go and use there, Mojeek is invariably in the top 3. Just so happened I got lucky at noon today, and we were actually right at the top. That's not usually the case. We're usually about second or third. But you can see it's significantly faster than Bing, certainly the search services, not surprisingly, and yeah, well, Google's way down there the chart, as you can see. So just to finish, search our engine. Mojeek is a search engine. We think, we still value, the discovery, navigation, and transaction that happens on the open web. We don't think the open web is dead. Its demise is overestimated. We think that our job is to provide information and then for people to make up their own minds, debate things, investigate things, and so on. So we kind of like to think that we respect human intelligence, and certainly more than we respect artificial intelligence. I can't help mentioning about decentralization, which is a buzzword that's been used, of course, in all sorts of fields, but is being used in search in not very, what can I say, opaque ways, sorry, not very transparent ways. Decentralization, it would be great if it was the solution to search, but really because of the response times, it's decentralizing web scale search is going to be really hard today. And what really the biggest problem we have is monopolization. It's not just about search; it's about the the browser barriers and operating systems and so on. So with that, I'll. Oh, by the way, I just thought I put into Google. I put in the query search your answer engine and got back the answer from Google that one ad, one organic result, a lot of instant answers, and 2 more organic results from Search Engine Land, I think, and Search Engine Watch, which are kind of part of the Google ecosystem, you might say. So that was kind of telling. And with that, I'll finish. And I haven't left much time for questions, so I do apologise. But thanks for listening. I hope you found that interesting, and sorry for talking very quickly.
So first of all, if people have questions, you can go ahead and put them in either the Q&A or the chat. And while I'm waiting to see if anything comes up there, first of all, thank you for a super like that was how the sausage is made of the search engine, and I don't think we've seen anything like that. So it was helpful and interesting to give us that perspective on a company that's really trying to build something and what your concerns are. So the one question that I have, I don't know if you can, if you need the slide for this again, but early in your presentation, you talked about the 2 big new features that you rolled out lately. One was choices, and the other one was focus, right?
Yeah.
And so could you talk to us about a little bit more about those from the end user perspective, what those things do? We could see a little bit on your slide, but I didn't quite pick up. I know what the choices does because I'm familiar with your search engine, but maybe other people here don't really understand what that is and what that capability is, and then also some examples of how we would use focus.
Okay, so maybe I'll just, what I'll do is actually, I can maybe even do a live, quickly showing on the screen. So I'm going to, one moment. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully show. it's not showing now. I'm going to stop. Okay.
We can see it.
Okay, I think, yeah, it wasn't the right one. Hopefully you can see it now. Can you see, what can you see now? Firefox?
I see Maryland.
Maryland, yeah. Okay, so here, this is search choices. So in here, so I've got a search here. I've set this up so I've got 0 length snippets, by the way, which is, if it's looking a bit why you can't, wonder why you can't see the snippets. At the bottom here, I've got search choices gives you buttons. I've actually set it up so we've got 8 different. So I can say on search choices here, I can go to start page, and it just redirects to start page with the same search query. Okay. So if you're not happy with the results you get from Mojeek, you can go straight through and go to somewhere else. Okay. So Brave and Yep have similar things. You can also do it from the search bar. So I can go in here and I can click on the DuckDuckGo logo and it will go through there. So that, yeah, basically with one click you can get results from 9 different services there. Okay. So the other thing I was going to show, unfortunately the bars come across the top, obscuring my view, is the focus. So what I have here, so can you now see the Mojeek focus?
Yes.
Focus dashboard. So in here, here's a focus dashboard. So I've got some of these, there's some templates to provide. I've got here a search engine which I set up to do video search. Okay, so I don't know what's going to happen here, but you'll see I've set up a number of sites here. I said to kind of search BitChute, PeerTube, Odyssey, Vimeo, Brand YouTube, and so on. And I can search on that. And if I do a search on that, that will then give me, you can see here where my mouse is, it's for focus. I'm getting results just from that part of the web that I've defined myself.
Yeah, so could I say that one of the reasons that focus is helpful is since you are returning clean results, not based on preferences, that this is the way for a user to indicate their preferences for certain types of searches.
Exactly. So yeah, I know that I've got this set of websites which I know provide results which I think which I regard as being authoritative or useful, and it's a subset. I want to search across that subset of the web.
Okay. Do people have other questions on these or other topics? Okay, then if not, first of all, I want to thank you again, Colin, for giving us some insight that we wouldn't have had, and I would say that some of the content here might be good for sharing with some of our students who are interested in the details of how people think about search engines from beginning to end. So thanks again very much. And
well,
we're
thank
getting
you for the opportunity. Yeah, yeah, I hope you found it interesting. And I think I left my contact details on the last slide. So if people want to get in touch.
You did. We'll make this talk available on our YouTube channel, and we'll share the slides on our website. And I'm getting people saying, yes, Marianne, our students need this. So, and before we have to, before we kind of sign off, I just want to thank everybody for coming to our first event for the Fall Speaker Series. Our next speaker will be Julie Smith from Webster University on October 27th, and she'll be talking about topics in media literacy. And we look forward, Colin, to keeping in touch with you and with Mojeek on what's going on there. And I know I'll be sharing the information and the search engine with my students in particular. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.